So, communicating self in a networked world. I've been studying this topic for the past 5 to 6 years, but I have to admit that I was kind of slow getting on the wagon of social media research. So at the time when Nicole and Cliff were doing some exciting things about social media, looking into social capital, I shied away from it and was doing other exciting things. But then there were two events that kind of drew me in, and so I'd like to share those with you today. So the first one is that I came across an announcement to apply for the International Media Conference on Personal Relationships that was sponsored by International Association on Relationship Research. And so I'm going to read it to you. Psychologists pay close attention to developments of individualistic societies in which human bonds start to play a reduced role and the virtual world gives appearances of real human contact. Some researchers point out that modern man is facing a trap of focusing on the self, satisfying one's needs at the cost of relationships. And so this idea of focusing on the self, the trap of focusing on the self, versus trying to connect with others, trying to develop relationships, that's something that intrigued me greatly and drew me into social media research. Why it was so interesting and intriguing to me? Because in my previous research, I have done work with Crystal Jiang, with Jeff Hancock, looking at intimacy, drawing on Rice and Shaver's model of intimacy as an interpersonal process, which states that intimacy develops as a result of self-revealing interactions, which impart us with a feeling of being understood, being cared for, being validated. And so in my work, I was looking at attributions, and what we found in our research is interpersonal attributions. When we think there is something special about your relationship with another person, that leads to intimacy. So it's not about situational attributions when you think it's a norm to share self-revealing information. It's not about dispositional when you just share information with everybody and everybody knows that. It's about your interpersonal connection with another person. And so started to think about intimacy as an interpersonal process. I wrestled with how this idea of interpersonal intimacy translates to social media environments. Is public intimacy possible? Or is it an oxymoron that doesn't even exist? Because you cannot have public intimacy. And so since then, I have done a number of research studies that looked at intimacy, whether it's possible to have it online, when you share information with everybody in a network kind of way, and what the effects are. So that was the first reason that drew me to study social media. And the other one was this question: what drives people to share information, personal information on social media? And I did not come to this question right away, but it emerged as I was seeing what I characterized as inconsistency between what people are doing online on social network sites and what we know from traditional models of self-disclosures that were premised on dyadic exchanges. And I'm going to explain it to you in a moment. But right now I want to show you this cartoon that I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with. Can I see a show of hands if you saw this cartoon? Right, so everybody knows that, right? On the internet, nobody knows that you are a dog. It was published in 1993 in the New Yorker by Peter Steinfeld, and it was reproduced in the famous hyperpersonal theory paper in 1996. That's how I came across it. But what I want to show you today is that there was another cartoon that was published just last year. And here we have a couple of dogs, maybe relatives of those dogs, maybe grandchildren, and now they are reminiscing about the old times. Remember when on the internet nobody knew who you were? And so I thought it was interesting to think, and it just shows us the changes that have been happening with Web 2.0 with sharing information, not in an anonymous way, but more in identifiable, interlinked, public way, when our identities are known to others. And so this idea of sharing yourself has become a defining concept for social media. So in this excellent paper by Nicholas John that was published in 2012, he shows how sharing yourself has become a constitutive activity of social media. And it became just recently that social network sites started to use this idea of share, not a tangible object, but share your life, share yourself, share your world with the world. So since 1997, so since 2007. So this is a pretty recent idea. And so what do we see in social media? That people respond in droves. We share millions, maybe even billions of content every day. And most of the content that we share in social media is actually personal in nature. So some work by Moore and Naaman shows that if you look at people who share information about themselves versus those who share some other information, it's about 80% of people are me-formers, what he called me-formers. So sharing content that involves ourselves. And if you look across content, it's about 40% of what we share involves ourselves. And in my research, we show that depending on the platform, it can be even higher than 40%. And this is actually not surprising. Because what we know from communication, from speech research, about 30 to 40% of what we talk about in daily life involves ourselves. So this is not surprising that we see it in social media. And why do we talk so much about ourselves? Because it has personal and social rewards. So a recent study, for example, showed that sharing self-referential information activates cognitive and neural mechanisms in the brain that are associated with rewards. And people sometimes are willing to forego monetary rewards in order to be able to share about themselves. So that's Tamir and Mitchell study. I also mentioned that sharing about yourself, sharing personal information, opens a door for social and personal relationships. And finally, we know that from the expressive paradigm developed by James Pennebaker, that self-disclosure has benefits on well-being, psychosomatic benefits. We feel better when we are able to express ourselves. So this is really not surprising, but what was surprising to me when I started thinking about self-disclosure is that people's behaviors in social media, they do not conform to behavioral models based on the eidetic exchanges. So if we look at the models of self-disclosure, we see that people establish a dyadic boundary. The idea of a dyadic boundary is very prominent. Because disclosure implies not only rewards, but also certain risks. When you share personal information, you become vulnerable. You take certain risks. According to the traditional theories of self-disclosure, you establish a dyadic boundary where you feel comfortable to share personal information without being violated. So that's the idea of dyadic boundary. You try to protect information from leaking what Pierce and Sharp called third parties. And third parties are people in your network whom you don't know well, but they are somehow connected to you. So that was one idea. The other one was that sharing is based on tie strengths. You don't share the same information you share with a close friend or a stranger. So it's based on tie strengths that you adapt your level of disclosure, content, and depth. And finally, it's a gradual and incremental process. So Altman developed a theory of social penetration where he compared the process of self-disclosure to layers of onion. First we share peripheral layers and then we expose deeper stuff, something that's more meaningful to us. So now let's look at what's happening on social network sites. We see that these principles are not upheld. We see a contradiction between what people do and what the models say that they should do. We see that people share personal information with large, often ill-defined, sometimes even invisible networks. And those networks are composed of third parties from which we're supposed to protect information. So how do we reconcile the two? That was a big question for me. The other one is that we see that social media networks, they give us context collapse, where people from different walks of life come in the same network. So for example, if you think about your Facebook network, you probably have friends, colleagues, roommates, maybe friends from your childhood. So all kinds of people, maybe even strangers. So you have a context collapse information, but you still share self-disclosure, the same disclosure, often by default, with the whole network. So how do we explain that? And finally, instead of being a gradual and incremental process, we see what I call a process collapse, because you can share information about something that's not really meaningful to you so much, maybe your movie preference, and then something much more meaningful like a sexual preference. So all types of information comes together in the same process. So how do we explain these contradictions? And I wrestled with that for a long time, and the question for me was the functional approach. So for me it was a moment of eureka, because I started thinking about goals. So in order to understand what's happening in social media, we need to look deeper beyond just disclosure behaviors, but think about what type of rewards people are looking for when they disclose information. What's driving them to self-disclose in social media? And so I came across this quote that says that if we wish to understand and predict individual self-disclosing behavior, we must identify and measure the major sources of value that self-disclosure has for individuals. So we have to look at the subjective values. Why do people do it? And then the other quote was that one possible explanation for the differences across paradigms is simply that the interview situations have different goals than do dyadic situations. And so Miller and Reed, when they looked at interview situations, how people present themselves, what they share about themselves when they come to the interviews, they realized that we are looking at a very different type of self-disclosure, and they called it broadcasting self-disclosure. Because you think about how you present yourself, and that's different from a dyadic situation. You present more packaged, more polished information about yourself. And so their explanation was that maybe people pursue different goals when they share information in these different situations, because those situations make selling different goals for them. And so by looking at these goals, we can explain the differences across paradigms. And so once I started thinking about goals, I started seeing goals everywhere. So different social media platforms suggesting to us, like me, listen to me, follow me, watch me, etc. and etc. So before, I was just seeing me, social media, me, self-disclosure, and then I also started seeing goals. And so that led to several studies. One of the studies that I'm going to present to you today looks at socio-technical affordances and how they affect, how they change people's goals, may change people's goals, and also affect self-disclosure production. We also looked at the connection between affordances and social network attributes, because I think in the network world, we have to think also about how network attributes influence disclosure. And I'm not going to talk about this paper today, but there is a study that compares Twitter and Facebook and how these two different affordances and network attributes influence people's disclosure goals, disclosure behaviors, and also privacy concerns. But the second study that I do want to talk to you about today is looking at goal satisfaction. So if we know the types of goals people are looking for, do they actually find what they seek? What does goal satisfaction depend on? And finally, the third paper, builds on this framework of thinking about this constellation of factors, socio-technical affordances, network attributes, as well as human factors, how they influence what we do online. And those of you who are familiar with Palin and Durish's work, you probably recognize that this is inspired by their idea of circumplex of different factors that influence privacy behaviors. And so the third study is going to look at human factors, and specifically, I've been interested in mental health, distress, psychological distress, and depression, and how it influences what people share online, what kind of rewards they gain from sharing online behavior. So the first study is on disclosure motivation. And so when I started thinking about Facebook, I realized that by looking at different channels that Facebook provides, we actually see private messages, private channel, as a classic dyadic condition. Because when you have a private channel on Facebook, you share information with just one person. And I thought, that's really interesting, because this can provide a baseline for comparing what people do publicly. So here we have this classic condition, dyadic condition, but then we also have status updates, where people share information publicly with everybody in their network, but it's not directed at any specific person. So just sharing information, almost like public speaking, right? And then we have posts on others' timelines. When you put information on somebody's timeline, on somebody's Facebook page, it's directed at a specific person, but it's also visible to your network, to that person's network. So it's directed but public. And so thinking about how these audiences are represented online and how it influences what people share, I ran a study, and the method was pretty simple. We did a retrospective diary study where we asked people to share with us what they had previously shared on Facebook. So they went to their Facebook and gave us 6 most recent messages from status updates, from posts on other timelines, and also private messages. We asked them to rate intimacy of those messages, and then we asked them to reflect on their goal. So there was this question, what goal did you try to accomplish with this message? So challenging self-disclosure, coding self-disclosure goals presented a challenge, right? Because the previous quote, one of the quotes I showed you, it said that capturing self-disclosure goals, but also measuring self-disclosure goals, right? So for us it was a challenge. We did not want just to give people scales and ask a question, why do you share information on social media? We wanted to tap into self-disclosure goals for communicative behavior, for what they shared previously. So it took us a while to develop a coding scheme. And first we coded whether a post, a message contained self-disclosure. And so we found that 58% of all the posts that people had shared with us contained self-disclosure. But then we also coded for goals. And so we developed this coding scheme with 7 different goals. So one is social validation. When people share information, in order to validate their self-concept, looking for social approval, looking for social support. The other one is self-expression, when you have to vent out, you share information. The third one is relational development, when you want to develop relationships with others, initiate, maintain. Then fourth, identity clarification, you want to clarify something about identity. Then social control and resources, when you want to gain resources, you share information because you want to gain something back. Then there was also a category when you share something about yourself in order to benefit others. And finally, you do it in order to store information for information storage and entertainment. And I wanted to show you this as well, because if you think about these goals, there is a continuum of self-orientation versus other orientation. So if you look at the goals in red, you see self-expression, identity clarification, information storage. That's for me. So these goals are very self-oriented. Then if you look at the blue ones, social validation and social control, it's still for me, but there is a dependency, interdependency between self and others. You really need others to validate your self-concept. You want approval from others, right? So it's not just you expressing yourself and you don't need anybody. It's you, but you depend on others. And finally, then we have the green one, that's you and other, where it's both about you and the other person. So here is an example of self-expression. Today already feels long and it's only 1 p.m. And so when we ask a person to reflect on the goal, he said, had a long day and I was stressed, I just felt like venting. So we found that lots of self-expression goals have this venting motivation behind them. Social validation, here is an example, my laptop smells like coffee, yay for ruining my laptop before the end is due. And the goal is trying to gain sympathy. And finally, relational development, where the goal is I wanted to reconnect with an elementary school teacher. So let me show you the findings. So we found that there were differences in disclosure intimacy. So if you look at private messages, we do find that they are more intimate, more personal in content, compared to those that were shared publicly. And so this kind of supports the idea of a dyadic boundary. When you have a dyadic boundary, you feel safer to share more personal information. But let's look at the goals now. So I'm showing you the distribution of 4 most frequent goals, the frequency, and we see that for relational development, that was the most frequent goal that people had, then social validation, then social control, and self-expression. But let's see now at each channel specifically. So let's look at private messages. So what we see in private, this baseline condition, where you have a dyadic boundary, we see that the most frequent goal, the most prominent goal is relational development. So people share personal information in order to develop relationships, and then social validation, etc. Now let's look at posts on others' timelines, where people share information with another person, but it's done in a public way. So what do we see there? We see that relational development is still high, even higher than in a private condition. So people share self-disclosure in order to develop relationships. We also see that social validation is quite high, actually significantly higher than in the private condition. And I think it's explained by publicness, that it's visible to others. But now take a look at status updates. Visible, public, but not directed at anybody. And we see a spike in social validation goal. So this suggests that when you have a message that's not directed at anybody, and everybody is listening in your network, social validation is the goal that's driving most disclosures. And the second one was self-expression, when you just have to vent out, when you have to share personal information. So again, with status updates, we see that about 70% of all status updates were driven by these 2 goals, social validation and self-expression. When we look at others' timelines, again, visible, right? Think about public intimacy. We see that about 50% of self-disclosures were driven by relational development. And finally, private messaging, 45% relational development. So what does it mean? What do we make out of this result? First of all, we see that disclosures have different types of underlying motivations and goals, right? They have different sources of value, and it depends on where you share information. And then to this question, so what's happening with social media? Do we focus on the self? Is it about us? Or is it about relating to others? We see that it's actually both. And it depends on where you share information. Whenever you have targeted communication, you are connecting with another person. 50% of it is driven by the relationships, by a relational goal. But when you have undirected communication, public, it's mostly about social validation. But even in that case, it's not just about you, right? Because social validation implies some level of interdependency between you and others. You depend on them for the feedback, for approval, for social validation. So this has all kinds of implications for understanding relational effects in social media. For example, there are a number of studies now that look at different channels on Facebook, in contrast to early research that looked at Facebook as kind of monolithic social media platform. And those studies suggest that it's directed communication, public or private, that leads to better relationships and improve well-being. And so here is one of the explanations. It's directed communication because that's where people pursue relational goals. That's how we develop relationships. So that's one of the explanations. I also wanted to show you how different goals predicted different disclosure intimacy, thinking about different paradigms and how the interview situation is different from the etiquette change, and how goals can elucidate what's happening with different paradigms. And we see that when you have a relational development goal, and we have self-expression and emotional relief goal, those lead to most intimate disclosures. Whereas when you have social validation goal, you share less intimate information. So what does it mean in terms of thinking about whether we're seeing a new type of self-disclosure in social media? How do we reconcile between people's social media behaviors and traditional models of self-disclosure? So we ran a mediational model, and it suggests that disclosure goals actually mediate between affordances and disclosure behaviors. So what we think and what we propose in the functional approach is that we're not seeing a new type of self-disclosure behaviors. You know, it has always been in us that we want to validate our self-concept, we want to connect with others. But that certain affordances, certain platforms can activate and make more salient those goals that have always been present for us. But now we have a platform to go to social media and seek social validation and find it for us. So that's the functional approach. And now I would like to share study number 2 that actually looks at goal satisfaction. So, do people find what they seek online? Do they find what they seek in social media? And so this is a paper that I presented at CSCW last year, so my apologies for those of you who already heard some of this paper, but I'm going to go briefly over methods and then point out the most important findings from this study. So what we did in this study, the method was kind of similar but also kind of different from the first study. We used a Facebook application in this study to access people's most recent communication instances, what they shared in the past 60 days. But instead of asking them to produce it for us, Facebook application actually gathered those messages and then it filtered it for the presence of 3 words. We wanted to have messages that contained 3 or more words. We didn't want to have the birthday and so on. And then we also focused on emotional words. So we wanted to have messages that had some kind of affect words. And so then what happened? So this is what we got. And then our participants were able to see those messages that were filtered by the Facebook application, and then they answered a number of questions about message intimacy, about the extent to which their goals were satisfied, to which they were satisfied with their Facebook interaction. We also captured the number of responses and likes they got to their message, and also how satisfied they were with those responses. So again, the focus of this study was trying to understand whether people satisfy their goals and what goal satisfaction depends on. So again, message characteristics, intimacy, personal relevance, valence, overall satisfaction after sharing a message, number of likes, number of comments, satisfaction with replies, and their perceived usefulness. So let me show you briefly the results. So we looked at overall satisfaction of the goal. How satisfied are you after sharing something on social media? And so what we found, that there was an effect of valence. The more positive information you share, the better you feel about the outcome. Not surprising, right? Especially knowing social capitalization theory, that we want to increase our positive emotions. And when we share positive emotions with others, it multiplies. It's a social capitalization effect. Then also people felt better after sharing personally relevant information. The more it is important to me, the better I feel after that. Not surprisingly, the number of comments and likes also predicted satisfaction. But in addition to that, we also looked at reply satisfaction and also reply usefulness. So looking at the replies, and they were able to see their original message and also the replies they got, how satisfied you are, how useful do you find them. And what we found is that there was a whopping effect of reply satisfaction. So the more satisfied you are with the replies you get, the better you feel about the overall interaction and about your goal satisfaction. And the number of replies, as you can see, actually became non-significant. It did not mean that the number of replies did not matter anymore, but there was an indirect effect for both personal relevance and number of comments that went into reply satisfaction. So, what do we make out of these results? Do people satisfy their goals? What does goal satisfaction depend on? We see ultimately Facebook from these results as a social experience. It's not just about yourself, right? It depends on what other people say, what they reply to you, and the number of replies, number of likes, and also quality of responses. They matter for goal satisfaction. So it's both about quality and quantity. And finally, the third study that I would like to show you today is the study where we're starting to look at human factors. So again, thinking about the circumstance of network attributes, of media affordances, but also human factors. We are all different. How do we capture this difference? How do our differences affect what we do online? How satisfied we are with what we are doing in social media? And so specifically, we've been looking at mental health and well-being. And so the question for me has been, how do real-life mental health states affect disclosure content, language style, motivations? And how do we understand the association between disclosure and mental health? When people are depressed, when they are distressed, do they share information about themselves online, about their depressive states? And so let me just show you some statistics that show that anxiety and depression are very serious issues among college students. So just based on the National College Health Assessment within the last 12 months, there were 11% of students who were diagnosed in depression, almost 13% in anxiety, and that was a national sample from more than 170 different colleges. And if you look at their self-reported data, it looks even more sobering. 45% felt hopeless, 55.9% felt very lonely, and then 31% felt too depressed to function. So it's a serious issue, and there is now burgeoning research on social media and mental health, trying to understand how we can use social media data for intervention, but also for early detection of depression and distress. And so what we did in this study, we screened participants for psychological distress, for depression, and also for self-injury behavior. So we started with Cornell students, but then we went to other colleges as well. And so we asked people during the past 30 days, how often did you feel hopeless? And that's an example of the K6 psychological distress measure. And so the mean for us was 12.06, and the range was from 6 to 24. And then we used Megan Moreno's coding scheme to code for symptoms of a major depressive episode. So the social media content that we got from people, and we used the same Facebook application as in study 2. Then we coded this content for depression episodes. And we found that they were quite infrequent, so only 3% of status updates contained some kind of depressive symptoms. And overall in our sample, we found that 4.5% of people were displayers. So those who displayed a depressive episode even once. And then we found that there was a significant connection between having psychological distress and being a displayer. So when you experience psychological distress, there is a significant connection that you can be a depression displayer on Facebook. So some other findings coming out from this study, we also found that people who have psychological distress, they were more concerned about how they present themselves online. So this is kind of interesting, right? We see that depression symptoms are rare, but people still do it. But then overall, we see that depression displayers are also more concerned about their self-presentation. They worry about what audiences will think about them. We also found that there was no differences in number of likes, number of comments that people get based on their distress level. Whether you're distressed or not distressed, you get actually a similar number of comments and likes. However, looking at people who have psychological distress, they are less satisfied with the replies they get. Their mood is affected more for the rest of their day by their social interactions. And then they feel less satisfied overall with social media interactions. So even when they control for the number of likes, for the number of comments you get, people who are distressed, they still feel less satisfied with what's happening on social media. So we continue with this research, and we're trying to unpack this question, trying to understand why. Is it because of their psychological distress coloring their perception of overall interactions? Or is there something in the quality of replies that they get that make them distressed? Because what we know about psychological distress is that people have conflicting motivations. On the one hand, they want to have self-confirming information. And that can be negative, confirming that I am not a good person, I am not worthy. On the other hand, they have this self-enhancing motivation. Please give me something that will make me feel better, that I'm a better person. And there is a crossfire model that suggests that these conflicting motivations, they lead to more distress, to more depression. And so right now we are looking at the quality of comments, coding replies, trying to understand the source of dissatisfaction. We also wanted to point out a couple of other studies that we are doing in the mental health arena. So one is recognizing and responding to distressing messages. So how do people recognize? How do they respond to messages? So do we know that it's a distress when we see it online? What are the factors that influences how we respond to those problematic messages? And then another study is we're looking at bystander effects and cyberbullying. And finally, we also look at well-being and connectedness in different media, looking at the predictors in different media that can explain the feeling of well-being. and how media factor into it. So I also wanted to show you this framework that we use for thinking about self-disclosure behavior and effects. Again, going back to this circumstance idea of human factors, of media affordances and network attributes, how they affect disclosure goals and production, goal satisfaction, disclosure perceptions, how we make sense of what we see online, and finally, psychological and social effects of disclosure. And in my group, we are starting now to think also about tools and interventions, how understanding these problems and basic science behind these factors can inform the development of tools and interventions. So I would like to acknowledge my wonderful collaborators, faculty, and graduate students who work on this project, and also the funding agencies, NSF and NIH Grant and Cornell sources. And thank you to everybody here who came and listened to me. Thank you.